Hi, welcome to another Thoughtful Talent Show. I'm Jen Werner,
And I'm Chad Ahern.
and today we're going to talk about the Clifton strength responsibility. Chad and I have both have this really high in our top five, so we thought we'd talk about this one today. Chad, do you want to share with us what Gallup says about responsibility?
Sure. So because I want to be responsible for Gallup's research, I'm going to read it verbatim. So people exceptionally talented in the responsibility theme take psychological ownership of what they say they will do. They're committed to stable values such as honesty and loyalty. So Jen, I understand that as you just highlighted, this is really high for you. This is actually your number one top theme, correct?
It is.
So can you start us off by sharing a little bit about how this talent theme shows up for you and maybe what others should know about this talent theme?
Sure. Yeah, it is my number one. And I will say, before I knew it was my strength, I just thought it was the way everyone was. So it's almost like a burden in a lot of cases for me because it is really heavy. So if I see something that should be done and I don't think someone else is going to do it, I'm going to step up and I'm going to take responsibility for that. So like in this case, I really do feel like the word responsibility and the definition for responsibility, like Webster's definition,
Yeah.
and actually the strength are really close. At least for me, they feel really close. I've always been like told that I'm a responsible person. I pride myself on being responsible and loyal, and that I'm a hard worker, that I'm always doing my best to like try to keep this from being the burden that sometimes I feel like it is, because I do take on
Yeah.
a lot of things just to keep everyone around me happy. I love to help, and I think that's the way it shows up the most for me, is that if I see someone doing something and I think I can help, I want to be there. I want to help.
Yeah.
What about
So,
with you?
well, so I'll get to me in a second, but I want to ask you about something that you brought up in some of our previous conversations, which is
Mm.
the idea of saying no to things.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and I know, and this I'll tease a little bit about what I'm going to say, but I think we've had mutual conversations about it's really hard to say no. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts that you wanted to share
Yeah.
on that aspect that might be helpful to people that are watching us and learning about responsibility.
Yeah, saying no is extremely difficult, especially if it's something I want to do. So if it's a great idea, I might say yes before I even know if I have time to do it. So I can get caught in this place, and we're not really talking about pitfalls yet, but I'll touch on it. That yeah, I can get caught in this place where I am going to say yes to things and then be like, oh God, I really don't have time for this. So then I'm stretching myself thin, trying to get everything I want to do done. My coach, when I first got my Clifton strength, my coach Abby was amazing and reminded me that it's okay to say no sometimes, because saying no to some things leaves me time to say yes to things I really want to do. So, even like trying to put myself first in that case, um, we talked a little bit about the this idea of being a flight, how the flight attendant tells you on the plane that
Oh
you
yeah.
should put
Yeah.
your oxygen mask on before you help others. So in this case, it would be similar to that. Like, make sure you work through what you want to do. You put yourself first. You get some of your priorities straight before you add on to it, because you can tend to take on more responsibility. Having responsibility high, you can take on more projects, more things, without realizing that you might be sacrificing either your quality or what you would really like to do, or even yourself, by stretching yourself too thin.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it is a wonderful talent theme that can help build a lot of trust, because people,
Mhm.
if they ask you to do something, or you know somebody needs to pick up a project, you can, I know for myself, that's one of the places where responsibility shows up for me is and in the context of saying no, or jumping in and saying yes to things. um, I tend to see projects that might be great ideas or need to get done, but that others aren't necessarily jumping up to do, and you're like, well, somebody's got to do this, so it may as well be me.
Mhm.
And There's some other talent themes that I'll touch on a little bit that probably feed that. But it is something that, in terms of saying no or finding space for yourself, sometimes you're more, at least for myself, I'm more apt to jump in on something that's being left unattended, I guess you might say. I think the other place, you asked me how this really shows up for me. And I think there are really sort of three places where it has it becomes very prominent. And one is, if you ask me to do something, it will get done. As long as I know the timeline, the end goal, and what available resources there are, it will eventually get done. I will do my very best to hit, the intended timeline. I will fully admit, especially since some people that know me might be watching this, that occasionally the timeline doesn't get hit exactly. But that's the thing about responsibility, is it sort of gnaws at the back of your head.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I still got to get to that thing. I still got to get to that thing. I still got to get to that thing. And day in and day out, or hour on hour, that feeling is either sitting in the back of your head or in your stomach. And I think that's something that others who don't have responsibility need to know about people that do have responsibility, is that they may have missed a deadline and it's probably eating at them. So yeah. I know that that's one thing for me. So the second thing is, and this has a double-edged sword too, a double-edged side to it, is if you're not early, you're late. So I will tend to show up places 5-10 minutes early, and that's completely acceptable. Others may look at that as wasted time. I'm thinking, you're wasting my time by not being here on the nose to start the meeting. Oh, is that Buddy?
Buddy wants to be responsible also,
okay,
and be part of the conversation.
Just that being early, I see that sort of cushion time, or being early, as being respectful of, hey, we're going to start this meeting on the hour, on whatever timeline has been established. And I'll, to be honest, get sometimes a little frustrated when people are walking in the door at that, thinking we're going to start the agenda 5 minutes into that time window. Yeah. So that's one place that it kind of shows up for me internally. And again, there's sort of two sides of that coin that we'll talk about in a minute. Yeah. And the third thing I would just say is, especially looking back at the definition about stable values like honesty and loyalty and psychological ownership, those often come out for me. I've been told that I act more mature than my age. And it's because there's a certain seriousness, and it probably is influenced a little bit by deliberative that we talked about in our last episode. Yeah. But responsibility plays with that a lot, and comes across as a super sense of maturity, in that I want to get things done. I want to get the right things done. And I want to build trust with others by completing my commitments. And so I think those are the three things that really come out for me in living out my version of responsibility.
Yeah, I love that you were talking about the expectations, and like making sure that you knew, like, if you know what needs to be done and the time frame involved, and you have all of the pieces. I think that's something that, like, I've learned even just recently. Like, when I'm asked to do something and I've signed on for it, I'm like, oh, hold on, let me make sure that I have this right. So what is it I really need to be doing? Like, when does this need to be done by? What are we looking for? What is that end product that we're trying to get to? Because my expectations, I found, are quite a bit higher than a lot of other people. And I tend to hold myself to a higher expectation than what others might be holding me to. And I found I also then do that to others. I hold them to a higher expectation than what they might be expecting. So, on both sides of that, like, me sharing my expectations with others, as well as asking their expectations of me, I found is extremely important, because that's where all of this breaks down, right? Is in that communication. If we're not communicating this information, you might be expecting that we're going to come to this meeting and start on time and immediately start talking about what we're supposed to be doing. Everyone else has the expectation we're going to chit chat for the first 5 minutes.
Right.
Some other strengths of mine have a really big problem with that too. So So, like I can totally see that and
Yeah.
catch, how that expectation piece is so key to,
Yeah.
the responsibility being able to do what they want. And what you
Yeah.
said really resonated with me.
Yeah.
That like pit of your stomach. That's where I
Oh,
say like this almost feels like a burden, right? To have it, because it
right.
is something that if it's not done, it's there like itching on me. And oh my goodness, I
Yes.
don't know about you, but if I make a mistake, I'm gonna own it. And I'm not just, oh, sorry, and move on with my life. It's like, how can I make it up to you? Like, what
Right.
can I
Yeah.
do to like make this better? These are the steps I'm going to do next time so that this doesn't happen again. There's a lot of
Yeah.
that happens with
Yeah.
responsibility, at least in me and others I've coached that have it too.
Yeah. It's definitely something that I completely resonate with that. The other part that I resonated with that I want to maybe fine tune it, because I might not have gone far enough in my own definition, is um, when you talk about timelines,
Mhm.
really spelling those out, because I've had in the past leaders or colleagues say, oh, well, we need this done. Okay. When you say it that way, that makes it sound like you need this done by the end of the business day or the end of the week.
Mhm.
And in their minds, I've come to find out later, oh, they're like, by the end of the quarter would have been
Right.
fine, or the end of the month. Okay, well, that's a very different time window. And I think something that others might need to know about responsibility is time windows are really
Mhm.
important, in terms of that expectation building. It's not just what the work product needs to look like, it's how much time, what's the deadline. I think that's
Yeah.
one of the big drivers for at least my version of responsibility. It sounds like it's touches on yours. And I think what we've found from others that we've talked to that have responsibility is that that's also part of their sort of makeup, is that um, the deadline is kind of the driving force. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I think those it's nice to talk with somebody that also has it, because you're like, you think everybody else is built this way.
Yes.
And then when you find they're not, it's also nice to run into those that also have responsibility. So for those of you out there listening to this going, hey, I was that kid in high school that, had those group projects and I always felt like I was the one responsible. You're made special. That's a wonderful thing about, Clifton's strengths and understanding our talents, is that we start to identify what's special about us. It can also be sort of that, there was a word you used about sort of an ownership or weight that you carry.
Mhm.
And when people aren't carrying their own buckets, um,
Yeah.
responsibility can get sort of agitated to sometimes a point of frustration.
Mhm.
But that we are all built differently, and that if you're having those feelings, you might have responsibility high.
Right. Yeah. I always say that like if that happens, like if someone's not respecting my timeline or um with not giving clear expectations, maybe aren't showing up on time, aren't pulling their weight. Oh, I love working with others with responsibility. Like I know that they have their part, I have my part. We know we're going to come together and it's going to be awesome. But please don't bother me in the meantime. Like, let me just do my
Oh,
part. I'll let you
yeah,
do your part. No micromanaging necessary with the responsibility. We're very happy to just be independent workers. I think that's
yeah,
something that that I've learned about that too, is that they're definitely can be very independent, um,
yeah.
accountable. Like you can hold them accountable for the work they said that they're going to do. Um, and I was going somewhere else with this, and I've lost it. So
No,
I guess
no.
we'll come back.
well, I think the thread there though is, um, and I think we talked a little bit about this in the pre-show, which is, in a culture that puts a lot of emphasis on teamwork and being a team player,
Mm, yeah.
responsibility, those with responsibility talents really kind of have a unique engagement with that fact, is that it's not that they're opposed to working as a team. It's that the team needs to lay out those expectations, clearly define everybody's sort of role. And then once that has happened, the team needs to be open, especially team leaders need to be open enough and trusting enough to let that responsibility member kind of run off on their own.
Mhm.
And it's not that they've abandoned the team, it's that they've gone to their part of, I use a lot of sports analogies because I also bring a lot of sports coaching, especially soccer. It's like they're running to their part of the field to take care of their duty. I'm coaching young kids right now, and we're always on our strikers to play up the field, even if the ball is way down at the goal, because we want them ready to counterattack. Well, them standing off by themselves is them being irresponsible. They're being responsible for their part of the field and their part of working as a team to move the ball in the other direction. I think the same thing comes to play in a workplace. Let a person with responsibility go off, have a little bit of freedom, no micromanaging, and expect them to come back and play the ball or play their part in the project when it's their turn to do so. I think that's a huge understanding for responsibility.
Yeah, definitely. So we've kind of touched on those like high points. What's amazing about responsibility, at least in us and some of the others that we've coached. Are there anything that you've noticed in clients that you've coached, whether it's like where we call these some of the pitfalls or some of the things to watch out for with responsibility?
Well, so I think before we get to maybe the benefits and pitfalls, there's something else that you and I talked a lot about in our preparation for this, which is that responsibility really seems to be seasoned more so than other talent themes by the talents around them. And I know Gallup tells us, and we as coaches know this, that no theme operates in a silo. But if there is one that I've seen more seasoned by the talents around it, it's probably responsibility. And I know that, for me, mine is really colored a lot by my analytical, my learner, my deliberative. We talked about deliberative in the last episode, and that's my responsibility. So I sort of have a duty to watch out for hazards, like we talked about, being that watchtower. I have a duty to stand post. That's the responsibility part melded with deliberative. For responsibility learner, a willingness to learn new approaches to get the required result. Talked about the expectations. If I don't know exactly how to get there, or there's a new process I need to learn to help me get there, my learner kicks in and drives that responsibility forward, or the responsibility drives the learner. I guess is probably a better way of putting it. And then the analytical, that's where often my analytical gets pulled in or seasons of my responsibility, because it's looking at the prioritization. If I have a to-do list of all the things I'm responsible for, the analytical goes, okay, which one of these is going to take you the most time, or which one of these can you bang out in the next 5 minutes, sort of using that 5-minute rule to get things off your plate so you can focus on the critical work. So that sort of seasoning happens, I think, a little bit more with responsibility. I know that you've talked about a couple of yours that you pointed to Activator earlier. I know that you've got a couple others that drive or season your responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I found most in my responsibility is that, like, the achiever is my number 2. And so it tends to make sure that I'm getting as much done as possible in the time I have. So where you're early to meetings because you want to make sure that everybody's ready to go, I'm seeing if I can get these 5 other things done before I leave. So, we might need to go somewhere in 15 minutes, but I'm going to spend those 15 minutes trying to do like 7 other things, all at the same time. So
true achiever.
Really trying to get things done. And, I'm heavy in the executing. Like I have 5, I think, of my top 10 are in the executing theme. So my work, everything I do is about getting stuff done. So that tends to, really pull to that achiever. And then in belief, like I think we talked in part of the pre-show stuff, that my belief seasons my responsibility, because I'm kind of watching to make sure that we're doing the right things, that we're like being ethical, that we're not cutting corners and trying to do stuff quickly to just get it done, like that we're actually doing the right things. So like you with the deliberative, watching out for what could happen, what could go wrong, but on, that's the belief, it comes from a deeper level of like, we just shouldn't, if I think we shouldn't be doing this, like we shouldn't be doing this, and not because of a danger zone as much as this isn't the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And yeah, my activator definitely like will pushes me to say yes to things before I've really thought through them. It's also that one that like I know it's going to keep me moving things forward regardless of how much we're trying to pull everybody back. So that it's always about getting the work done.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What I love about that seasoning though, like how these other strengths tend to season the responsibility, is someone that's high in some of those relationship building themes and also has responsibility. Their responsibility ends up really being about others, and not so much like you and I with the work and the learning potentially there, kind of that forward thinking like you were talking about with some of your strategic thinking strengths, but with the responsibility, they really are others focused, and it's making sure that like everybody has what they need. And it's almost like the mother hen in that moment. Like that's how responsibility comes out with people who have high responsibility or high responsibility and relationship building themes, is that they are so worried about other people.
Yeah, I think there are two beautiful thoughts you play out there. One is I want to come back to your belief, because I think there's a point that you made yesterday as we were preparing for this, is really bring the values of, are we doing the right things? So you made the contrast. Mine are my responsibility is heavily influenced by a lot of the either other executing themes or strategic thinking. So it's a lot more about true action, whereas your belief is seasoning almost at a deeper level, which is this the right thing to do at a values level? I think that's something that's really interesting for people to probably understand about. I think the other word you used yesterday is almost the consciousness of the team, that Jiminy Cricket character for the team. And that's playing that role.
Very timely, being that Disney Plus is going to launch their new Pinocchio here in the next couple days.
Maybe that was why it's so consciously in my brain. But I think it is that subconscious. It's that, hey, are we? I think you said it beautifully. Are we doing the right things? I would also just come back to what you were saying about a lot of the relationship building. I have a couple of those, in like 6 through 10 for my Clifton Strengths order, and while I don't have includer super high, but you could, a responsibility to make sure everybody's included, especially in this day and age of a lot of the DEI initiatives, positivity, making sure that we're sort of instilling that hope and that things are going to get better or things can be better. And so those I think are really great to touch on, that, again, those will season how responsibility shows up. So, so you had started to ask about, you started to ask me about benefits and pitfalls, because you have this much higher than I do, 1 versus 3. I'm going to ask you first, what do you see as sort of the true benefits of this, either at an individual level or as a team member, but maybe start with the individual and then go to the team?
I think as an individual, the benefit for me is just knowing that I am taking things seriously, that these things I do, these things I say that I'm going to do, like it becomes the driving force for me to like build trust with others. So that's one of the biggest things I think responsibility does for me, is it helps me build trust with other people, because they can depend on me. They know they can count on me. I think that translates right into the team member. If you have a team, if you have people on your team who have responsibility, you can count on them. They're going to be there for you. They're going to pull through and finish the things that they said they were going to do. When it comes to the pitfalls, I'd say like I could see where, taking on too much responsibility, taking on too many projects, trying to do too many things, that tends to get in our way a lot. So just making sure that you keep that, careful balance to not to go too far, saying yes to everything in the wanting to help and wanting to be there, wanting to be responsible. Part of that is looking at your workload and making sure that you are responsible about what you say yes to.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Do you have,
again, we're starting to hear, for those listening, we're hearing Jen's achiever and responsibility peek out, wanting to take on the fullest to-do list possible. I don't want to speak for her, but Jen and I have been around each other long enough. So I think that's great. I'm going to add a couple of things just from my lived experience. I think, we've already talked about sort of the ability to work independently. The benefit is that for leaders that have led me or that teams I've been on, that the ability and the opportunity to go work independently. We talked about that sort of soccer analogy, allowing me to sort of take care of my own zone, and just not staying out of the way. I appreciate check-in, just like, and notes of recognition and appreciation, which, most leaders know is how you really sort of drive positive performance. It's that positive reinforcement piece. I appreciate that like everybody else, but I also don't want to be micromanaged. I don't want you stopping into my office every other day going, so how's your to-do list going? It'll get done when it gets done. We set out the expectations, especially if that layer has been established, then my to-do list is going to be based on that. And so I think that's one piece that leaders should be aware of when they're engaging with people with responsibilities. There's a great benefit. You can just let them go. I already talked a little bit about the maturity part. I would also say that the benefit, and this ties a little bit into the learner comment I was making, the combination of responsibility and learner, is that responsibility has also led me into places where I've been able to expand my horizons. So for those that might be listening with responsibility and learner talents or something similar to that, if you have a responsibility for something or see a project that's not being addressed and you want to go pick it up, and have the space and time to do that, like Jen just mentioned, making sure that bandwidth is not being extended, but then going, okay, now what can I learn out of this? And I think that there's a great personal benefit to combining those two things. The benefit for the team, if we extend it out to the team, is if there's a new project that needs to be taken up, that's important to the team, that has an established timeline, put it in somebody's lap that has responsibility and learner. You will get what you ask for, because the responsibility side of that equation won't let somebody like myself come back to the team with something that's half-baked, and that they will use strategic thinking themes like strategic or learner to go out and really investigate what is going to happen here. What do we need to know, or how do we need to plan forward? And then the last sort of real benefit is that we've talked about sort of the gnawing sensation, but the benefit is my to-do list is never very far from my mind.
Yeah.
And so even though, I write it down, I have it on my desk, but when I walk away from my desk, that to-do list is still traveling with me, almost as those gnawing feelings in the back of the head. So that's kind of a benefit. It can have a negative feel because it's that weight that you carry too. So those are some of the benefits. Did you want to talk to any other pitfalls of having responsibility, so high in our orders?
Well, where I see it the most, and not pitfalls necessarily as much as like when responsibility is raw and you are taking on too much and you are putting work first instead of people. So that's another one of those things that they tell Gallup and everyone, all of your coaches would tell you, is that you need to make sure that that work doesn't become more important than the people. So because it does tend to, like Chad said, it's weighing on you. You're carrying that to-do list around. That you have things that you promised people that you said you were going to do. So you need to do it. You need to follow through. And if until you do, it's hanging on you, waiting. So in that case, I can see there's so many movies I could talk about, Chad, movies, TV shows, and things that they're some of my favorites. Erin Brockovich, it would be one.
Yeah.
It's like just to share a bit of that feeling. So there's a scene in the movie where Ed comes to Erin and he tells her that they need to get 90% of the signatures in order for their arbitration to go through. And and she's like, how are we going to get 90%? She's been sick. They put her out, like she says, they put her out in Siberia transcribing to someone, to, you know, these other lawyers, and that this other team screwed it up, that they don't understand, that the people don't understand. And so now Ed's going to take it upon himself, and he's going to go in and talk to him, you know, because she's too emotional, and this isn't personal, this is business. And she unloads on him, like, how can you say this isn't personal? Like, this is my job, this is my family, this is my time away from my kids. Like, if it's anything, it's personal. And I will say, like, that thread right there is what responsibility feels like to me when I'm working on a team and I'm doing everything I can, and I feel like either the team around me isn't pulling together to get it done, or other people aren't pulling their weight, or if someone is downplaying the like investment, what I'm giving up to make sure that this happens and happens in the, you know, the right time. You know, I think that's, again, like some of those things go to my belief, like this is really about like following through on what we said we were going to do. And when that doesn't happen, or someone like belittles that feeling, like that, those movies, like those things like that one, the other one that came to my mind was Leslie Knope on Parks and Rec. So this Amy Poehler plays Leslie Knope, and she is, oh my gosh, I'd love to talk about just her strengths as Leslie Knope, because she's a complete nut, but definitely has responsibility high. You know, she's sick with the flu, but she's trying to get everybody on board to like give money to the Harvest Fest, or she's, you know, like putting on the kids concert even though the government's shut down, and she's single-handedly doing it herself, you know. So, you know, it's that type of, I said I'm going to do it, I'm going to follow through. So as much as that is such a benefit, it also can be a pitfall when you put your blinders on and you don't see anything else but the end goal. So I think that's one of those, you know, you have to be really careful, because it can tip like in an instant from mature to raw. We talked about that last time with deliberative, you know, how that line is so fine, and how quickly you can, you know, go down the rabbit hole and find yourself just buried. And the same, I think it's very true of responsibility.
Yeah. I think it's great that you point out, I'm not as big a fan of Parks and Rec as you are, but just the examples you give of, you know, wanting to keep taking things on over and over and over again, I think it can be a pitfall. I think one of the other things that is worth noting there is that team leaders that are leading or managing, whichever word you want to use, I tend to like the leading side. Those leading those responsibility, it's almost your duty, your responsibility to watch out for their responsibility. Is that if they get sucked into that cycle and all of a sudden they're weighed down and then don't have, you know, bandwidth for their families or for their kids or for you know, their other passions, then you're losing out on, you know, a really hard worker, but helping them manage that weight so that it doesn't become a 400-pound in somebody's stomach or on their brain. It's a more manageable, you know, 50 pounds or 100 pounds, you know, something that's still worth carrying, but is not going to kill them in the process. And so
that's such a great point, Chad, because I do think that's one of those ones that we've noticed too with people with responsibility, is to give any of that up once they say yes, they feel like they're letting everyone down. And like we talked about at the beginning, you don't just make a mistake and say, oops, sorry, and move on. It's this like trying to make up for it. So even in that moment where you had to now give a project up to someone else or ask for help, it feels like a failure to ask for others' help. It feels extra, it just adds to that weight. So it tends to keep us from reaching out when we really do need the help. So I love that idea on the team leaders, in order to like have them like keep a watch on those people with responsibility, because they're going to be there for you and can be there better if we're making sure their load is appropriate.
One of the great suggestions I've heard about helping those with responsibility, and it's a tough thing to do. I carry, you know, that talent theme, live it just like you do, very high, very intense. That line on, you know, positive to negative, you know, mature to raw is super thin. But one of the places, or one of the ways I've heard leaders can really help responsibility manage that feeling of letting the team down is just sort of reprioritize,
Yeah.
what, or reset some of the expectations. Okay, yeah, this project A, yes, we do need done by the end of the week. Okay, great. But these other three I gave you, oh, those don't need to be done. You can do this one at the end of the month, and this one at the end of the quarter, and this one is, if you get to it like 6 months from now, great. Now you've taken that 400-pound and split it into much more manageable weights. It's not 400 pounds all at once. It's 50-pound weight here, 50-pound weight there, 25-pound weight further down the road. Drop a couple pebbles, 6 months from now. And so now it's distributed. And so it doesn't feel like that giving up, or that I've made, a mistake or a failure. It's just redistributing the responsibility. So that's something that I toss out there for any leaders listening. If you know or think you have somebody with high responsibility, that's a great way to help them manage. Were there any other pitfalls you want to mention? Because I know I've got a couple that I want to make sure I want to share, because we live our responsibilities differently.
I think I've definitely pounded on the overcommitting. So that's a major pitfall. I think burnout was where I was leading to that last one, where, like if you're doing that for too long and you're not getting, somebody isn't helping pull you out of that, it can definitely lead to some burnout. We talked about that whole, the work tends to be more important than people sometimes. We're also people with responsibility can also tend to be bad delegators. So we might not think like we should give this up to someone else. And what might be some of the reasons that we're not giving it up? Like, where maybe that expectation is you're not going to get the attention that we would give it, or something else. But so those are like my major ones. That I was seeing, like in people I've coached and with myself personally.
So I want to just add on to something that I think it's really important to remember from the original definition. Remember that those with responsibility take a psychological ownership. Yeah. So it's not just as simple as putting words on a piece of paper, as part of a to-do list. Those with the responsibility are almost ingraining that into that task, into kind of who they are. If I don't fulfill this, then something is maybe not wrong with me, but that I have not lived my best self, or that, I'm not contributing as I should to a team or to my own life. There's a psychological component. We talked about sort of that weight in the belly, or the gnawing on the head. That comes from a deeper place than just writing out a series of words or a to-do list. And I think that's really important to remember. And that, I think, goes to your point about how easy or not easy it is for somebody with responsibility talents to give something up, to delegate it out. And the other thing, and I think we talked a little bit about this yesterday in our pre-show, is that ownership piece extends to, okay, this was my project to begin with. If I'm going to hand it off, it better come back to me in a state that I would have generated, even though somebody else did it.
Right.
And I think, I know I'm guilty of that at certain points, that if I hand something off, okay, and they're not doing it the way I would want to do it, I just want to bring it back and I'm going to do it myself. Yeah. And so I think that there's a piece there that is worth keeping your head about, that you pay attention to.
It goes right back to those expectations, setting the expectations, or maybe they need to be adjusted, it's just like we say, I had a girl that I used to work with, and she would say, well, do you want it done fast, or do you want it done right? Because you're only going to get one.
Right.
And it's true. So like, if we're setting the expectation that we're doing this by the end of the day, well, then you might get worse quality work than if you said that I had until tomorrow at the end of the day. So it's that setting the expectation and making sure the expectation actually can be accomplished in the amount of time that you're giving the work to be done.
Yeah.
Sure.
Some wonderful pitfalls to be aware of. I'm going to just point out two other ones that kind of build on what we've been saying. One is that, and you've really brought this to a head, is oftentimes those with responsibility will put the commitments to others ahead of commitments to ourselves. And so that, if I have something I know I need to do, but, oh, that person over there, I've made a commitment to them, even though this, commitment to myself to do something that's going to be long-term beneficial is probably more important. Responsibility will sometimes push you in the direction of, well, I need to help others first. And it goes back to that flight attendant analogy.
Yeah.
So without beating that statement, I just wanted to put it out in the way that I've thought about it, is that putting your own actions toward the bottom of the list versus where they should probably be, which is at the top of the list. The other one, sorry, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, one of the things that I've noticed in my work life and working with others, having someone near me who has high discipline has been extremely helpful in making sure that I am able to keep the right things up at the top, because I will get bombarded by other people who want things, and I'll be like, oh, sure, let me get that for you. And in the meantime, I've let the things that were important to me go, or maybe, like you said, go by the wayside. And so even partnering with people who have high discipline, they can help you with that. If you have high responsibility and you don't have high discipline, I don't, having someone around me that has high discipline helps me like make sure that, I'm able to keep those things right and in check. And that I'm not just letting things that are important to me go, because they're going to help remind me too.
Yeah. I could also see somebody with high focus could also play a similar role. And I'm sure there are others that we could think of. Again, they all play out differently, right? And we're going to talk about that as we go through this series. But yeah, I think you're right. Somebody that can really kind of narrow down on what's critical or what needs to be stay front and center. Just going back to one other pitfall that I think people should be aware of, at least, and I've seen this show up particularly in myself, and I know some others with responsibility have talked to me about this, is that you can often hold others to very high levels of expectation. So let me give you an example and it's not even high levels of expectation. It's just a reasonable level of expectation, but you put such a high importance on it. So an example, and it's going to start out small, but I think there's an analogy to the workplace. I have two relatively young boys, love them to death, love them to pieces. When I ask them to do something, whether it's something as simple as, hey, we're going to go to soccer practice, which is something that they want to go do in the first place, and I'm asking them to, put on their soccer equipment, shin guards, cleats, soccer socks, etc. I ask them that once, and then I walk away expecting that they're going to do that because going to soccer practice is important to them. And I come back 5 or 10 minutes later and nothing has been put on, or we've got one sock on and everybody's thinking about cleats, maybe. That then leads to a lack, it's perceived as a lack of patience on my part, but it's going back to that expectation piece. Is I've asked you something, I'm expecting you to do that. And then when they don't, it goes back to that sort of broken trust that you've kind of hinted at as we've gone through this conversation. Is if you don't do something that I've asked you to do, or I'm trusting you to go off on your own, kind of like I like to, and you don't do that, then that starts to break down the relationship. And I think that same thing in the workplace. If I, as somebody behind responsibility, am willing to hand something off, or hey, take a lead on that project, especially if you're a team leader and you need to delegate, but then that person takes their time doing it, or is lax in doing it, that really comes back and starts to eat at those of us that have responsibility talents really high.
It's like eroding that, right? So I like to say, like, it's almost like an offense at that point. Like my strength, my responsibility is offended, like that you did not take the thoughtful care, or responsibility, like pull you care, I gave this to you and you were supposed to pick it up and carry it on. Yeah, and that's how it feels to me, like my strengths get offended. And rather than saying I'm going to be impatient with them, I say like my strength got offended in that case, because it does start to erode that relationship, like you said. Like that's where it starts, and then the next time you're going to give something up, maybe not going to give it to them.
Right. Or you're going to think 2 or 3 times about handing it to them, or you give them a smaller piece of it.
Right.
This
goes into a perfect place, Chad. So in other cases, I've seen like the managers, like that's happened. And then the next time, well, now I'm going to hold your hand through every piece of it. So now I've went from a leader who's like going to give this up. You're going to grow by learning this new thing. And because you did such a lax job last time, now I'm going to hold your hand and micromanage you through this entire process, which also does not help anyone.
No, it does not fulfill one of the 4 needs of followers, which is to develop trust. So yeah, and again, setting those expectations, I think that's one of the places where the knife edge is really thin, is that responsibility can do a great job of setting expectations. You know, we're starting to bleed into how this can benefit teams. Responsibility are great people for laying out expectations. The challenge, or the flip side of that really thin knife edge, is if you don't, then you start to destroy or erode. I think that's probably a better word than destroy, but erode at some pace the relationship and the working ability of 2 people to partner together, or the team to come together collectively and collaboratively. So
it's definitely all based on that communication, having that communication up front, being able to like set those expectations as a group, as a team, like what we expect and when and who's going to do it. You brought up the high school okay,
group
we're
projects,
break up in teams, and I'd be like hiding or looking for the one other person that I know is gonna like do their part, and then I'm like, oh God, please don't put me with so and so. Like, oh no, like please no. And then that made me, like as an adult, that made me go into like college and first working experiences, and when they're like, so we do a lot of team stuff here. Are you a good team player? And I'm like, no. Only if I get to work with, you know, this person and that person, you know. So that is one of those things that I'm still working on, and that's why I came up with those lists of questions. What needs to be done? When are we expecting it to be done? And what do we want our end product to look like? And who is going to do the work?
Right.
The 4 key questions to set these expectations for my responsibility to not get offended.
That's, you know, just re-listening to your questions. I mean, it's the old, you know, who, what, when, where, why, right? And for those of us with responsibility themes or talents, the when and why, or the when and where, but the timeline component is probably needs to be moved closer to the top of that list in terms of your W questions. So did you want to talk any more about sort of best contribution of this talent theme to a team? I mean, we've started to tease it a little bit.
I really think that like knowing that they can be that person who's actually going to help you be like loyal maybe to your cause. We talked a little bit about the conscience of the team. And maybe that's a little more me because of my peppering of belief in there, but they can help keep your team accountable to what you said you were going to do, and by the time you said you were going to get it done, right? So, and nobody likes this, like, okay, we're going to do this and like we're going to do it by tomorrow, and then like 3 weeks later still nothing's been done. So I think having people with responsibility on your team, you know, they have that ability to carry through and actually get to the end project. I think also with a manager, how this could be beneficial as a manager is they have that high work ethic too. They have that responsibility, so they can even like build trust with their team members by getting in there, rolling up their sleeves, getting their hands dirty, working alongside their people.
shoulder to
really
shoulder.
like model the behavior, some of the behaviors that we expect. And yeah, then you're building trust with your team. You're actually like getting some of that camaraderie going, and that we can together accomplish something.
Yeah. Any downsides?
Other than all
Lots.
my other ones, yeah. Yeah, it's really that, like, I'm going to say that the two, that the work can sometimes become more important than the people, that's really important to keep that front of mind, so that you don't start, I'm going to say, steamrolling over your team members, if they didn't get something done by when you thought it should be done, or something else. And with managers, even making sure that you're careful in that like very precious balance of the people versus the work. And then that like loss of trust, that then we both hit on that, where like when this doesn't happen, there's a loss of trust from the responsibility to the other people, that person who has a responsibility, it will start to erode that trust. And once it starts going, it's a slippery slope. So, bringing it back up to the forefront, talking about it, relooking at those expectations. I thought that was a great comment you made about like giving some people some parameters around when we are too busy, like what are some ways we can break this up? Okay, let's relook at those expectations, our timeline, what can we do realistically, instead of it becoming this just very overwhelming weight.
Yeah. I love both your the contributions and pitfalls you laid out. I want to go just a step deeper with one of them. You talked about how a member of the team can be really helpful in keeping the to-do list or the team expectations sort of front and center.
Yeah.
And this is going to sound like a bit of a repeat from our last episode on deliberative, but leaders, to get that contribution, need to give those individuals time and space to basically put that laundry on the table and say, hey, look, we haven't accomplished X, Y, and Z. Who's going to help us pick up the slack, or who is going to take responsibility for this? Because it should not all fall to the person with responsibility talents. It's their duty to, and their wonderful ability to bring up, say, hey, here's our plan. This was the plan. This was everybody, this is what everybody's so committed to. We haven't gotten fulfilled commitments from person B, F, and G. So we're at this state. Mm-hmm. And then having that openness to be able to put that out there, to then have I think that's one of the misperceptions sometimes of people with responsibilities. We bring that stuff up, not because we're trying to take people to task. It's because we're trying to figure out, okay, well, what's falling apart here, or what needs to be addressed so that we do hit the goals and timelines that we laid out, earlier on when we first started talking about this project. So I think that's a misperception that people might need to be aware of or think about when somebody's got responsibility talents and they're bringing that stuff up. It doesn't come from a bad place. Just like deliberative, what we talked about in the last episode, isn't bringing up risks for the jollies of it. They're bringing it up because they want the best for the team. The same thing plays here. The other piece the one other sort of negative impact that I'll bring up, particularly in light of a lot of the conversation going on now, if you're listening to this in the next week or so, or in the next couple months, this being September of 2022, there's a big conversation going on around quiet quitting. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are two sides of, and one of your comments got me thinking, actually, there are two sides to an issue that I was going to bring up. One side of it is that those with responsibility that are leading teams, if they lean too hard on those responsibility talents, they can be seen or legitimately understood to be unforgiving taskmasters. And so in light of the quiet quitting of, I'm going to do just basically what my job description says. These are the minimum requirements to do my job and keep my job. Those were the responsibility talents. Would be like, well, wait, we've got projects F through K over here that are kind of outside your job description, but we're not going to have a company if we don't get these done.
Right.
And there's a balance there. So if you don't get it right, you can really exacerbate already tenuous work relationships.
Mhm.
The flip side, and this is the part that I really love that you brought up, is that those are the responsibility talents. If they're leading and they're not seeing team members take on stuff, can then have the potential to become almost hermits. You know, they stay in their own offices, they take all the work on themselves, they don't delegate. And so that can have a real negative on team, collaboration, team understanding, team shared expectations, because everything is being held in one place. And so then the other team, the other team members don't know what they're responsible for, what their role is to play. And so I think that those two parts, when applied in sort of a raw fashion, can have a real negative impact on any team or group that somebody with responsibility talents is part of.
Those are great examples. And you're exactly right about that hermit feeling, because if you get a manager or a leader who's like that and they are holding back, you do feel like, well, I don't need to be here. Like, what's the purpose for me being here? I guess I can't do it as well as they can. So I'm just going to sit here. And it does lead to that feeling of, you're just like, you're not important. It's not, what I'm doing isn't important. And that can quickly, continue to erode those relationships that sound like they might already be tenuous if you're to that point.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point about purpose, which is, in light of sort of in parallel with the quiet quitting, people are really looking at what is the purpose of going, to work, whether you're actually going to an office or not, but the purpose of doing work. And if a leader with responsibility talents, misapplied, I would really want to emphasize that this we're talking about sort of the far dark side of an application of responsibility talents, because we've hopefully throughout this almost hour, we've really highlighted a lot of the benefits and where responsibility talents can really bring a lot, and that independent streak and be able to go out on their own and still contribute to the team. But when applied the wrong way, you get that hobbit feeling, and that takes away from the purpose of other people coming to the team's work. So I really appreciate you bringing up the idea of purpose. So before we wrap, we're almost at our hour. Do you have anything else that you want to put on the table for our listeners and our viewers?
I think I've said all I need to say about responsibility. Just, it's that weight, we know it needs to be done. How about you? Any last?
No, I think, the part about independent and not being micromanaged are probably some of the big things that we hit on, and the ways in which responsibility can both build and break trust. And I'm going to leave it at that. I hope everybody that has listened, is listening and watching, has enjoyed our second show on our Thoughtful Talent themes, Thoughtful Talents show, and hope that you will come back for the next set of themes that we'll address next week. And you'll have to tune in to find out what those are. So with that, we're both going to sign off. I'm Chad.
I'm Jen.
And we'll see you soon.